Hello, my name is Dan Thurot or Thurot. You can pronounce it however you want. It doesn't have a pronunciation. They changed it when we immigrated. Okay, principles of diversity begin with, I'm just kidding. So do I just touch this and it changes? Does anyone know? Oh, is this the button? Oh. Okay. Now, if you've done your due diligence and you've stalked me on Board Game Geek, you're going to realize that I do not have a game designer little merit badge on my profile. I don't have that. So you might be wondering, why on earth am I here? And what I do is I run a long-running independent board game review site called Space Biff. And what we do on Space Biff is we have a high focus on quality, insightful, critical content. The goal is that we always are going to be looking for ways that a game is valuable and a way that it can improve. But still, the question you might be asking is, why are you here? And that's fair enough. Now, I could list my qualifications. I could tell you that I play somewhere around 200 board games a year, new board games. And I could tell you that I spend a very unhealthy quantity of time thinking about board games. But the real answer is that I am not qualified. So thank goodness I'm actually not going to tell you how to design your board game. In fact, one of my big pet peeves is how often I will get a designer or somebody who likes a game but wants it improved, how often they will ask me, how do we improve this game? Maybe a house rule. That isn't my job. That's your job. So what is my job? Let's get it out of the way right now. A review is an expression of a reviewer's experience with the thing. Okay? That's my job. Now, we tell ourselves a lot of stories about what a reviewer is. Sometimes we think a reviewer can be objective, that a reviewer can create something that's true or false. Sometimes we tell ourselves that reviewers are handsome and sexually potent. And I'm here to tell you that most of those things aren't true. Now, the point, though, is take everything I say to you today with a grain of salt. There are a lot of ways that a thing can be reviewed, and I'm going to only be telling you about my process, the kind of review I want to see from other critics in our industry, and how you can enable us to get that kind of feedback from our critics, from our reviewers. And also, it's a little bit self-serving because I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the sort of thing I hope you consider before you send me a game, because I get a lot of bad games. Flawed games. Nothing you're doing is bad. Okay, so today we're going to talk about 3 topics. The first thing is going to be a little bit dull for some of you. I'm sorry, but when I'm sitting in your panels and it's boring for me because you're talking about playtesting, welcome to my world. Now we're going to talk about critical theory. The other thing we're going to do, and we're going to kind of do these together, is we're going to walk through the process of what I do when I evaluate your game, and we're actually going to critique a game together. Okay? And I've picked a game. It's a huge secret. It's a game I'm sure you've all played. Rommel in Africa. Okay, but we'll get there eventually. That's not the game. Don't leave. Stop. Okay, so here, let's start with theory. Now, I want you to tell me who recognizes this. Raise your hand if you recognize it. Okay, Aristotle. Well done. So what we call these are the key elements of fiction. And I heard somebody else say writing. Was that you? Yeah. So that's where I found the pieces. Right. So these are the key elements of fiction. Now, you probably had to learn these at some point in middle school, which is why you've probably tuned it out because you were too busy being bullied to really cement the memory. But one thing that we're going to run into, a problem really quickly, is that these don't really work in board games the way they've been written for thousands of years in other forms of media. For instance, if you look up there on the top left, what is that when we play a board game? Who's your character?
Well, ostensibly, it's the avatar.
Yeah.
In the game that you're manipulating.
Sure. And where does that fall apart? Are your players Fornax the Barbarian? Are they a firefighter? Unfortunately, they are not. And you can fill up your game with all sorts of things to persuade your characters that they are some character in your game, but your players are not going to all be method acting. Okay? And this is going to continue to all sorts of elements that we use to evaluate other works of art. Okay? When we talk about something like the point of view or the struggle, that's all going to be informed by the fact that you have human agents, usually plural human agents, taking command of your game. Now, we're going to take a little detour and talk about this. Once again, who recognizes this? Okay, Aristotle. Okay, long ago, Aristotle came up with the idea of the plot triangle. Yeah, pretty handsome, isn't it? Now, if you don't recognize it, I'm going to explain to you, just let's get through it really quick. Let's explain how a story goes. Okay, boy meets girl. He's handsome because he's handsome, and he's Freddie Prinze Jr. She's arty, and she has glasses, so she's ugly. Okay? The boy has an evil ex-girlfriend. He is dared to make any girl in the school go to become the prom queen. To get revenge on his evil ex-girlfriend, he decides that he's going to make this ostensibly ugly knockout into the prom queen. Okay? So now we're here, this is the conflict. The rising action is that they start being catty to one another until the ugly girl, sans glasses, suddenly is made beautiful. Okay? And this is where we start to get into our rising action. The climax is, of course, the high school prom, because no event is as crucial to the formation of a healthy human being as high school prom. However, at high school prom, the heroine does not become the prom queen. The guy does not care about whatever. They make important personal decisions that will alter who they are for the rest of their lives. The climax isn't when the building blows up, it's when the hero chooses to go back. Okay? To go back and save the hostages or whatever, or walk away from a toxic relationship. The climax is the moment of decision. Everything after that is falling action. In this, which is this is from She's All That, which is one of the finest examples of the late 90s excess. In this, the climax is that they fall in love and they kiss, and then Sixpence None the Richer plays Kiss Me for 10 hours. So that's where that denouement comes in. Now, it's important to note that none of these plot triangles are necessarily just straight up and down. We consume an enormous quantity of art in our day and age. Sometimes they go up and down. Sometimes they're episodic, so they find themselves repeating. Sometimes it's a straight nosedive because you're watching No Country for Old Men. But either way, fiction will chart one straight line from A to B. The author has predetermined it. Now let's look at a plot triangle when you're playing a board game. Okay. So you can see that here we've got somebody who owns the game. He always makes his group play it. He's a bit of a game tyrant. But no, he's not winning. This is terrible. And his friends are saying, hey, we can play something else. And he's swearing at them, and he's getting all hot under the collar. And eventually he persuades them, and he kind of social pressures them into winning, and he's doing great. So he won the game, but he didn't have the good time he expected. Someone else doesn't like learning new games, but then they do really well because they're just doing crap, and it turns out they're interacting with the game's mechanisms really well. This is most games, okay? And I'm going to throw a few quick tips in here as we're going. So our first quick tip that you can do to influence the healthy lifestyle of your critical community is you really need to find game critics who are going to play your game more than once. My policy on my site is that we will play your game at least 3 times. That's the best we can do, considering the fact that we get sent about 140 comped copies a year. but we are going to play it 3 times. If you send me some war game that takes 6 hours to play and makes me need to read a book, I will read the book. I will play 18 hours of your game before I review it. Now, as somebody who's sending out copies, you are absolutely capable of telling them that you expect them to actually play your game a few times, so that if they happen to play the game with Jeff, who's a big fat jerk and makes every game unpleasant, that that's not the experience they're reviewing. Okay? You have power over this. Now, that's just a detour. Let's go back to our elements of fiction. They're starting to look pretty messy. Now, what can we draw from this? There's a couple of things we can draw from this pretty much right away. One of them is, if you're trying to write a game the way you would write another work of fiction, it's going to look like this. This is the first 2 of 4 pages of exposition in a board game I was sent very early in my reviewing career. Okay? I will read this if you send it to me, but I do so grudgingly. Now, you shouldn't think of this as a limitation. You are set free from these expectations. Just keep in mind that your job is to enable your characters, but in this case, your characters are players, to tell a story of their own. So this is quick tip number 2. I don't care about your fluff. I don't care about your flavor text, and I'll read all of it. This isn't what you're here to do. You can get published on Amazon as well as I can. They'll take anyone. Okay? Now there's exceptions. Okay? If you're designing a great narrative game or some legacy game with a lot of these elements, don't listen to me. Okay? There's great games that do that. But one of the cardinal sins that I get is I get some great Euro game, puzzle game thing, and it thinks I want to learn about sentience for 5 pages. Okay? I don't. I had to learn that in college. Okay. Now, here's the second thing that I want us to take from our broken elements of style. This is where our hobby is trapped. Okay? 2 spheres, mechanics and theme. Who's heard those 2 terms? Who's heard those terms propped up in opposition to one another? Okay, we've been stuck in this for a while. The idea is that you can either have a game that is mechanically pure or a game that's narratively interesting. Is this game mechanically interesting or is it thematic? Okay? This is where we get this whole ridiculous Euro games versus Ameritrash divide. The thing is, we've been moving away from this for the last few years. But if you commit the cardinal sin of the internet by reading the comments section, you're going to realize real quick that a lot of people are still doing this. And not just the users, but critics and us. And we need to break away from that. There is a small cross-section of critics who are working with a different model, both in video games and in board games. The model is a little bit more robust, and it looks something more like this. Rather than 2 evaluative spheres, whenever I am sent a game, I evaluate it in terms of a few different spheres. The first is the mechanics. This is the rules, the systems of the game. And when I'm evaluating them, I think about them in terms of innovation, iteration, ease of use, the pleasure of use, and cleverness, that sort of thing. The next one is components. And if you don't know what that is, you should go to the diversity panel, because I'm not going to explain it. Okay, setting. Setting is what we talk about when we talk about theme, okay? This is the where and the who of the game. This is the time period. This is the role of its characters. It essentially is a context for the actions that you will take in the game. This is different from a theme. The theme is the what and the why that drives your players. It is a framework for the game's actions. It is a little bit different from setting. Let's talk about an example that I hope we've all played. Settlers of Catan. Has anyone not played it? We might get... All right, so we've got 1. We've got 2. Okay, so this won't make any sense to some people. Settlers of Catan. What is the theme of Settlers of Catan? Throw it out. There are all sorts of wrong answers.
Colonizing an island.
Colonizing an island. Okay? Who concurs? Okay, expansion. Who said that? Doing a good job. Okay. The setting of Settlers of Catan is colonialism. That's not the theme. The game itself says nothing useful about colonialism. It makes no commentary on it, and it's not what the players are actually doing. The game itself is about evaluating and manipulating the virtual states of currency based on risk. It's about trading resources based on a value where a brick is not the same value every game. It's more about economics than it is about colonialism. That's the theme. Now, once you play something like Spirit Island, has anyone played that one? Okay, does that have a theme of colonialism? Absolutely. It is making a concerted statement about colonialism. It is placing its characters, its players, into a role where they need to stand up against the pressures of a colonizing force. It is explicitly about colonialism, where Settlers of Catan is about something else, despite the setting being, exactly as you said, colonizing a little happy island that's apparently devoid of inhabitants other than a robber. Okay. Now, this model is still incomplete. There's one more box that we're going to add. And there's a lot of ways that you can talk about this box. The way that I talk about it is feedback. What this means is this is the integration of those elements of its theme, of its design. It's where we get into some really interesting questions about the design. For instance, how fluidly does the game's mechanics and setting interact to generate a theme? Do they inform one another? Do your actions make thematic sense within the context of the setting? And do you take actions in order to enact that theme, or just because you're figuring out a mathematical ideal? Does the setting help you choose what to do? These are the kind of questions we can ask. And perhaps most importantly, do the mechanics, components, setting, and theme make you feel something? Because when you feel something, you will generate a memory. And this is when players are going to remember your game and want to play it again. Right now, we have a very disposable culture, especially in board games. Does anyone know how many board games released last year onto the Board Game Geek database? That's right, over 4,000. How do we stand out amidst this rush of games? I can tell you right now, I've tested some of your games. You're doing fine. There are some really good ideas here. To stand out, it is not sufficient that you are mechanically pure, that you tell a good story. You must generate a memory. You have to generate an emotion. And it's very difficult to form a memory because you scored some points, for exactly the same reason that it's difficult to form a memory because you made a move in chess. It's a step toward a memory. It isn't the memory itself. What we remember is the moment of betrayal, the triumph, the clever maneuver, the comeback. Those are the types of things that will generate a play memory. And nearly all of those moments require the intersection of these elements, the feedback. So how do we talk about feedback? Now, when I write about feedback, I use a particular term. The term I use is elegance. Now, we run into a really quick vocabulary conundrum in this hobby because we too often, use the word elegant and simple interchangeably. They are not interchangeable. Now, I see you're shaking your head. Why are they not interchangeable? Okay, so expression. Okay. Sure, I think you're on a good track. So when I talk about simple, I'm talking in a very mechanical sense, that a game is straightforward, it's easy to learn, it doesn't have too many rules, it isn't too taxing, okay? The concept of elegance, on the other hand, generally indicates a level of grace, usually in the game's feedback. Are your options logical? Do your victory conditions make sense within the context of the game? Does every design aspect reflect every other design aspect? Questions like that. Does the language the game forms tell your players how to act? Now let's give some examples, okay? I want to give you an example. I'm going to go through like 12 examples just to really drive home some of these ideas that you need to be forming emotional moments. We're going to start with a game that I hope many of us have played. This is Tigris and Euphrates. Who's played this? Okay. I consider this one of the finest games ever designed for a few reasons. One reason that it's very useful to illustrate what we're talking about today is that it is not a simple game. If you've ever had to explain Tigris and Euphrates, the difference between an internal struggle and an external struggle, the way that kingdoms form and coalesce and break apart, usually it takes a couple games for someone to really reflexively get it. That is not simplicity. However, as a game, it is incredibly elegant. Everything you can do in this game informs every other option that you have. Now, Tigris and Euphrates is more than a tile laying and tile wagering game, the same way it's more than a game about the Fertile Crescent. The way that it mixes these things creates a feedback loop between its action and its setting. Your actions, when you place tiles, generate wealth and desirability, but also make other people want to come and take those things. And the setting itself is about the rise, the fall, the coalescence, and the eventual uniformity of a culture. And the game acts that out. You begin with small kingdoms and eventually push them together until they are unified. The takeaway, though, is that the enduring moments from this game aren't the laying of a single tile. They're grand apocalyptic contests between players. When you remember a moment in this game, it's because you built 2 temples in a turn. Or it's because somebody launched a coup that ousted you from your own empire. Or it's because you fought a war that ended up taking half the tiles off the board. Okay? Those are memorable moments. Now, let's go to the far other end of the spectrum. Okay? Let's go trashy. Anyone played Cthulhu Wars? Okay, this is a trashy game. Now, however, it does some really great feedback things. For one thing, the size of its sculpts is proportional to their strength in the game. When you slam down a piece, it provides feedback about the strength of that piece. It signals your potency and threat to other players. In artistic terms, we call this hierarchical proportion, and it's something that a whole lot of board games use. Okay? The idea that bigger is better, that bigger is more threatening, that bigger is worth more points. In order to be that, it has to be weighted not just mechanically, but thematically. That will get it across to your players that what they're seeing on the table is valuable. Now, let's move away from that for a second. Let's talk about some other emotions that you can try to create. How about stress? Captain Sonar's rules, for anyone who's played it, the rules themselves are nonsensical. If you've played it, the game is fast-paced. Nothing in the rules indicates that. In fact, it isn't until the game is tested in the social sphere that the need to stay ahead of your opponents, both to charge up your weapons and the need to literally stay ahead of their submarine, that's what pushes the tempo forward. It's the sort of game where 2 minutes feels like 20. And despite being a great game if you've got 6 or 8 players, it's the sort of thing most groups can only endure once or twice before they burn out. Another common memory-forming emotion is paranoia. Trader games are hugely popular right now, and that's not surprising. And it's not surprising because they're great at creating memorable moments. In my gaming group, one of our fondest memories is from Battlestar Galactica. I was a Cylon, an old high school buddy was a Cylon. My wife was the president of the whatever states, okay? Now, my buddy and I figured it out very early by blinking to each other meaningfully that we were the Cylons. He was able to out himself as a traitor and implicate my wife. Okay? She was immediately ousted from her office as president. She was placed in the brig. She was humiliated for like 2 hours of game time. And in the meantime, I was elected president, and I put our nuclear arsenal to great use. I made great executive decisions. And of course, we ate all the humans, because that's what robots do. Super memorable, okay? And it's not just rules, and it's not just the theme. It's an intersection of them. Now, this game, Homeland, does some interesting things. You don't even need a traitor in order to generate paranoia. The mere threat of a traitor generates the jitters from everybody in that game and creates an interesting theme about the paranoia felt by counterintelligence officers. Okay, here's another one. Leaving Earth could have been a spreadsheet game. The entire game is centered around one mathematical conundrum that you will do over and over, and it's very complicated, and you'll make mistakes and feel dumb. The conundrum is you need to have enough fuel to generate the thrust to carry the fuel. Okay? It's a complicated game, and its sense of exploration could have also been relegated to an Excel page. But it isn't. It places its sense of discovery first and foremost. You cannot find anything in this game until you randomly find it. It's an element of chance in a game that has a few, but by and large, it's about you doing math. But the benefit of that is that your lunar rover could sink into a sea of dust, you might find alien life, or a deposit of iron. But the thrill of it is that it's why you're doing those mathematical problems, because whoever does math best gets to discover stuff. You get to find out what's on Mars or Phobos or whatever. Taking a 180-degree turn, the fear of the unknown. In Escape from the Aliens in Outer Space, the rules couldn't be more bare bones. On your turn, you move, and depending on where you step, the coloring of that space, you make noise or you don't. Some of your friends are survivors on this derelict spaceship, or they're aliens. You don't know. And so you're kind of moving away from each other, but you're always afraid someone's going to chase you. And yet it's one of the tensest games I've ever played. It's memorable because of feedback, once again. Now, this is going to apply to a whole bunch of things. Negotiation games. All you're doing is trading chits in a game, but as soon as you're telling a story with the things you're trading, it can take on even real-world implications. And if you don't think so, you need to play a game like Churchill with a bunch of war gamers and listen to some old army vet debating the merits of Marxism. He gets passionate about it. Now, we could go on. We could talk about how a set of rules feeding through a well-designed setting can teach us something new about a well-known conflict. We could talk about how it can place you in some small approximation into the shoes of people who endured tragedies or other events. We can impart moral lessons. In Soul, Last Days of a Star, the game doesn't just tell you that resources are scarce and that you're running on a clock. Every time you take resources, it pushes the game closer to an end state. It sticks to its guns. Now let's just do one last example before we move on. This game is an infamous Traffic, and it's one of the more exciting designs to come out in the last few years. The reason why is not because it's an amazing game. In fact, it's a deeply flawed game. It's kind of unpleasant to play. You play as independent British families trying to traffic opium in China. Doesn't that sound like fun? Next time you're making a farming simulator game, consider this one. Okay. However, everything you do in this game is incredibly loaded. The board state can totally be upended by your actions. The placement of a single token can wreck the board state for your opponents and for yourself. But this is intentional. By forcing you to undermine your friends in ways that other games would balk at, it elicits a low-grade sense of guilt, even shame, especially when they call you names, which, by the way, totally supports its thesis that peddling opium and declaring war on a country to force them to buy more of your opium is kind of a shitty thing to do. But that's the point. The interaction between its rules and its setting, the way its components move each other, the tactility of them, is what generates something far more memorable than most games manage. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because it is such a flawed game. I want you to keep in mind, let's see, maybe I'll go one more slide. Okay, yeah, I want you to keep in mind that flawed games, as long as you are instilling some sense of narrative and story and emotion and purpose to your players, will be more memorable than a game with a perfect system or a compelling narrative. Because that's what your players want to do. They want to be the protagonist of the story. They want to have memorable moments. And that's why if you're working on a game that could be the next Lord of the Rings, or you're working on a game that Reiner Knizia would blush at, it isn't necessarily going to catch on. You can sit around being jealous of these games, and we spend a lot of time as critics and game designers talking about the problems with Dead of Winter and other designs that seem more popular than they deserve. But the successes of those are not that they're perfect games, it's that they're eliciting something that's an emotional response from their players. Okay, so that, yeah. Elicit an emotional response. It's the right thing to do. All right, let's do an activity. Okay, we're going to go through the process of a review, just really quick. And we're going to review a game of our own, okay? I hope you've played Rommel in Africa. Okay, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about chess. Who has played chess? Who has not played chess? You again? You played? Okay, you can raise your hand in pride. It's fine. We don't all need to like the same thing. Okay. I love chess. This picture is near and dear to me. My grandfather taught me chess. We played chess every week for about 3 years before he let me beat him. He was that generation, okay? No handouts. And this is from the game. Somebody made this for me. This is from the game where I finally beat him. It was very hard fought. Now, I don't remember every move in this game because it's chess, right? You don't remember every move. But I do remember 2 or 3 very important emotional moments from it. I remember trapping his queen in a checkmate, where no matter where he moved his queen, he could take one of my pieces, but he was going to lose his queen. It was an important moment. I remember the layout of the board at that time. I remember this layout. We had played over 100 games easily by the time I beat him. Emotional response. Okay, now let's talk about how we evaluate a game. It's going to shock and amaze you, but the first thing I do when you send me a game is I read the rules. And there's some tips to this. The first thing is that I do look for problems right away, but I don't put much stock in them because I haven't played the game. The other thing is I will read your fluff, but please tone it down, some of you. Next is I don't study the rule book. I know some critics do. They'll read it 5 times or whatever. I read it once, and then I play your game. The reason I do that is because I want to make the same mistakes that most end users will make when they play your game. Okay? When you're doing your testing, I hope that you're paying attention to people who are reading your rules and then playing it and seeing what mistakes they're making. Because I read a lot of bad rule books. That's on you. I can't fix that. Okay. Then the next thing I do, and this is going to shock you again, is I play the game. Now, we're having fun when we play the game, but that's not always the main thing. Let me tell you about Crap Patrol. Early in our career, about 2 years ago, we realized that we were getting 2 stacks of games that were being sent to us by publishers. One stack was the games that we wanted to play, the stuff we'd requested, and the other stack was stuff that, someone was launching a Kickstarter and they needed an eye on it and they couldn't get, Shut Up and Sit Down or Tom Vassell to look at it. So we got that stack. And we realized that this stack, we were getting through it, but this stack just kept growing. We weren't playing the games we weren't certain about. So we formed a group called the Crap Patrol from our elites. Okay, these are the ace pilots of our game group. And what we found is that very quickly, first of all, we found some games we liked. But more than that, even when we were playing the trashiest, worst, least optimized, you could see where the cards were cut, like art cuts off. When we were playing those games, we were still having a good time. That doesn't mean we wanted to ever play that game again once we were done. But we were having a good time because we were talking to friends and we were peeling apart the design, and some of the people in our game group are designers, and so we were asking hard questions, like where did this designer flounder between their mental image and this thing, that washed up on the beach onto our table? These are enjoyable things for us as critics to make fun of your games, okay? So when you're parsing and observing your players and they tell you they had fun, remember, that isn't always the most important thing. It is important. You want them to have fun, but you hopefully want to make them have memorable fun that they want to have again. Okay. So other things we do is we do take notes. We also take pictures. If something strikes us as interesting or broken, we immediately take a picture of it. The reason we do that is so that we can wait. So about a week after we play a game, we go back and we look at our notes and we look at our pictures and we go, oh yeah, I remember doing that. Or, and this is the one that's really damning, we look at it and say, what? I don't remember doing that. That's a bad sign. Okay? I would recommend that process to anybody. And the process is pretty simple. Now let's do this. All of us but one have played chess. So let's talk about it. I want to hear from you. Evaluate this mechanically. Tell me about chess. What's good or bad about it? Deterministic, okay. What else?
It takes a long time to get going, and often you know how it's going to end long before it finishes.
Some people do. I don't. Gary Kasparov sure does.
It's a game for 2 players.
Game for 2 players.
The pieces are very clearly.
Okay. Okay, so it's very clear. So we're running into some, okay, go ahead.
You have one player that's more experienced, the other player.
Okay, and that's something that's important to point out. When we talk about it being deterministic, skill levels is a way that it actually is a little bit random. Okay, what else have we got? Okay. Would you say that these rules are simple? Okay. Do they have exceptions? Yes. They have exceptions that don't appear in 4 out of 5 games. What are those exceptions? En passant. Castling you'll do sometimes. Like I do castling a lot. Every other game maybe. But en passant. Yep, pawn promotion. You never see if you're playing against. You only see pawn promotion if you're playing against someone who doesn't know it's a rule. And boy, is that a fun surprise. Okay, did someone else shout out something? What? Oh yeah, if you're good at chess, you want to do that and you're down to your king. Try to just survive for 50 rounds, and it's a draw. So that's a good rule. Okay, so the rules are pretty simple. There's a few exceptions. We run into a few problems there. But now let's talk about the components. Tell me about the components. Whew, I love these components. I'm spoiling it.
They can look like the Simpsons.
They look like the Simpsons. Yeah, some of them do. What was that? Yeah, you can customize them.
Very tactile.
Very tactile. Is that an enormously important part of chess?
Yes.
Yes. In chess, the pieces are miniatures. Okay? They do what they represent broadly. You can totally see some ancient person being like, this is what a castle does. It doesn't. But you can see him having that mentality.
Well,
But
castles started out as elephants. So
yes, that's true. That is true. But it does inform a lot of what you do. There is no move in all of gaming as loaded as when someone leans across the table, picks up a knight, and then snaps it into place. Okay? The tactile feedback in this game is tremendous. Okay? What's the setting? You've already alighted to it. What is the setting? It's a battlefield. Is that the theme of the game? No, not really. If you think a battle goes like this, you got to read some history books. It doesn't. So who was shaking their head? What is the theme of chess? Domination. You're on the right track. There is a lot of area control. Yep, interacting systems. Sure. Importantly, it's not just about overthrowing a kingdom, it's about overthrowing a kingdom where a particular person is untouchable. Okay? You can't kill the king. Which is why the game, if we want to use one word, is about entrapment. And here's the important thing about chess. This is where we're going to start getting into feedback. The king is you. And as the king is cornered, you are cornered. The reason this is so important is because this has become an easy shorthand for intellect. When you're watching some overwrought show and the genius hero is having a feud with some genius villain, what do? They play a mental game of chess, and we understand what they're doing. Even though they're saying nonsense, knight 3 to f6, that's not a legal move. But when they're saying stuff like that, we know what they're doing. That's how successful chess has been at ingraining its feedback, that we understand it even when we cannot vocalize it. That is feedback. Chess has problems. If you're of a certain skill, going first is a huge advantage. Okay, it's not a perfect game. I don't think anyone would argue that. And if Gary Kasparov here, he could wrestle me, but he's not, so too bad. But in terms of its feedback, it does a pretty perfect job of what it wants to do. Now, let's just keep this in mind. That's where you want to begin your game, with an experience, with an idea. And I won't tell you how to fix it. I won't tell you how to design a game, but I will tell you this. The games I appreciate most and the games I see other people appreciating the most, the games that I'm most inclined to give a positive review to, are the ones that begin with a user experience, the ones that fix onto an emotion or a memory or a fantasy and try to elicit that thing. If you want to give your players the satisfaction of solving a puzzle, then make that your game. If you want to make it an escapist fantasy, you can accomplish that. But all of your clever systems and novel-length flavor text, don't do that, they won't do anything unless they're in service of forming that memory. The conflict between rules and a setting is made up. We've been stuck in it too long. They work for each other. This doesn't mean your game can't be abstract, okay? Chess is enormously abstract, but it understands the importance of giving its audience just that little bit of a push so that they can instinctively understand what they're doing. Okay, that's it. Create memories. Are there any questions? Oh, thanks.
You used the word good a few times, and you laid out how the pieces and parts and that fit together. I'm curious, when you come across a well-crafted game that maybe it gives a memory, but it really didn't necessarily hit you emotionally, would you classify that as a good game because it was well-crafted and kind of lit up all those places even though it wasn't to your taste? So I tend to like most types of games. One of my goals with any game, I don't believe that there is any platonic ideal of gaming. One of my goals whenever I do a critique is that I want to talk about what's special about a design, but I'm also pretty open about any flaws. Right now, part of our consumer culture with games is that either a game is good or it wasn't what I expected. There's that binary. I do wish that we would push past that a little bit. It's rare that you'll find me gushing about a game without also talking about some places where it dragged us down. But in general, yes, I tend to prize experience over mostly anything else. If you have a good experience, I will forgive some mechanisms. For instance, since Ryan Laukat is here, he recently had a game that I gave a pretty positive review to, Empires of the Void 2. I think it provides a very solid sandbox experience. It gives you a lot of player agency over what you can do. It feels like a starfaring adventure game. I do think it has some problems. I think that those problems are very small in light of what it accomplishes. I don't think it's some super mechanically innovative game, but in terms of the experience it creates, yes, it's a game I recommend. Does that answer your question?
You've mentioned you don't like fluff text.
Yeah, that's true.
With that in mind, what do you look for in terms of creating an evocative setting? So here's some examples. So one of the games that I put up there, Soul, Last Days of a Star, Last Days, is it day or days? Days of a Star. Have people played that? So that game actually does do a lot of bombing of fluff. It has an entire book of
It has
stories.
a whole book, and I had to skim it. And I did resent it a little bit. But that game is really smart about the way that it takes its mechanics and it takes what it wants to say, and they support one another. That's the kind of question that I evaluate whether you did it, not how you should do it, so I don't have a great answer.
There are plenty of games that I play that have very successful fluff, but in general, remember that when we looked at our plot line, our plot triangle, that you aren't telling one story. So when you open up your Runebound Universe game and explain to me about the adventures of Red Hat Lady and, you know, someone else who has her breasts out and then a barbarian with a big axe, I'm not playing as them. So I have no emotional requirement to care about their adventures. I don't mind some flavor text on cards. I don't mind a paragraph telling me what I'm supposed to do. And I most of all love it when you place author's notes in the game. I love that. If you have a game that you want your players to know that they're peddling opium in China, you really should tell me. That's a great thing to include in your game. I will take that into consideration. I love design notes. Any other questions? Principles of diversity. Okay, no other questions? Can we just be done? Do I have to stand up here until the time's up? Okay. Okay, thank you.